So around here on Trace Velo, I'm known for testing out really cheap bike parts. Wheels, frames, saddles, group sets, you name it. I hunt down the cheapest bike parts that I can find, normally on places like AliExpress, and put them through their paces. I showcase the good stuff that I find, but also don't shy away from presenting the failures that I face. And yeah, there have been a few of them. Now, I got a comment on my last video asking whether, with the issues that I show you, do I ever get sick of using these cheaper bike parts? And the answer is yeah, sometimes I absolutely do. So why do I bother? And by extension, should you bother? Yeah, let's get into it. My name, as always, is Luke, and welcome back to Trace Velo. I guess I should start by saying that before I even had this channel, I was obsessed with cheap bike parts. Back in 2015, I really wanted a nice carbon road bike, but I definitely couldn't afford it. So I ended up going down a rabbit hole of Chinese direct-to-consumer bike parts. Snap to present day, and yeah, nothing's really changed. But here's the thing, you can definitely find some bargains, but some of the time these cheaper parts can be a massive pain. I mean, take the build I did in the last video, for example. I think it took years off my life. The electronic group set from Wheeltop that I used was quite frustrating to set up. This cheap carbon crankset broke on me while I was diagnosing problems with that group set. This cheap replacement crankset that I initially tried to use didn't actually fit, so I managed to cobble this one together. And the whole build was only required in the first place because I had so many issues with a cheap carbon frame from Trifox. Plus, it looks like that new frame, the new frame I used in the build, has a bit of a problem. I think it took some damage during shipping actually, but more on that problem later. So yeah, it was frustrating. Absolutely no question about it. So why do I bother? Well, I mean, there's no denying it's part of my job, and there seems to be enough of you lot interested in this stuff to make this whole thing sort of viable. But that aside, what is it about this approach that appeals to me so much? And importantly, is it something that you should replicate? Because ultimately, this comment is right in many ways. Also, just FYI, this is an abbreviated version of the original comment. I cut it down to make it easier to digest, but here's the full one in case you wanted all of the detail. This comment is right in many ways. I could get a name brand bike with Ultegra Di2 and kind of be done with the hassle. And with that in mind, there are probably some of you out there that think I talk about the cheaper stuff on camera, but then behind the scenes I ride an S-Works or something like that. But it's not true at all, unless I'm renting an expensive bike like I did out in Mallorca a few weeks back. The cheaper stuff, it's all I ride. This bike behind me is my daily driver. I absolutely love it, and in many ways it kind of epitomizes this whole ethos. It's 7.6 kilograms, been ridden for thousands of miles, it's super reliable, and all the parts used on it are incredibly cheap. Here's the parts list, and you can see it cost me about 1,200 quid. And there are undoubtedly things about it that a lot of people won't like. For example, the fact I used mechanical disc brake. But here's the thing, right? With a build like this, it's not just about saving money. So doing a build like this rather than buying a bike off the rack, for starters, much cheaper. I mean, this build, 1,200 quid. This kind of equivalent one from Specialized, over double that at 3 grand, and it's over 9 kilograms. This one is 7.6, like I said. But over and above that, there are loads of other benefits to this approach. Firstly, you build the thing yourself, so if anything needs replacing or adjusting, chances are you can sort it. But more importantly, in my opinion, for people starting out like I did back in 2015, this approach opens up a world of options in terms of drip feeding upgrades. Take this bike here, it's mechanical disc brake. Say you have a mechanical group set on an old bike, you can start with that and then maybe later down the line upgrade to a cheap hydraulic group set from L-Twoo or Sensar, or even go electronic with L-Twoo's ERX. Wheels too, so start off with some cheap aluminium ones, later down the line upgrade to some lightweight carbon jobbies. Now, I think what most people tend to do in terms of investing in a bike is a kind of big bang approach, right? So spend months eyeing up a new Canyon or a Specialized before taking the plunge and dumping 8, 10 grand in a new bike. Plus, with that approach, you're limited in options in terms of saddle, wheels, group set to what that manufacturer offers you. With this approach, you can kind of tackle the build in stages, upgrading as and when you choose, not to mention the fact that those upgrades are so much cheaper with these Chinese direct-to-consumer options. I mean, take this build, I could throw another 400 or 500 quid at it, get an electronic group set with hydraulic brakes, and completely transform the bike overnight. Also, while I've got you, these are cool looking third-person shots that I use. It's from a 360 camera I got as a Christmas present a couple of years back. And I somehow convinced that company to sponsor me. So yeah, it's Insta360, and I've been using their latest and greatest X4 360 camera, and it's so freaking good. Now they do sponsor quite a lot of creators, but it's because their stuff is like genuinely top tier. The quality of the footage is obviously crazy. It records up to 8K resolution, which is bonkers, and the stabilization of the footage that it does is genuinely very, very impressive. You can get cool looking shots so easily. I mean, I do everything by myself around here. I don't have a cameraman, so for me to be able to get crispy third person shots like this, or maybe ones like these where it looks like I'm being followed by a drone or something, with what amounts to me holding a camera on a stick, yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, as a one-man band, I think it's genuinely elevated my ride-along footage, and I've only scratched the surface of what this thing can do. Also, fair warning, this next shot does kind of look like I've just come out from having a wee. Anyway, if you did want to get some awesome footage, then check out the X4, and I'll put the details down there in the description for you. Anyway, let's crack on. Now, not to get too philosophical, but I think we can all agree road cycling can be pretty elitist. Now, it's got much better in the last few years, but I remember back when I lived in London in 2018, my wife went for a ride around Richmond Park on a folding bike and genuinely got laughed at by a group of road cyclists as she was going up Dark Hill. And I feel like what I do around here kind of pushes against that in some way. The enjoyment of cycling shouldn't come from the value of what you ride or the name on your down tube. To the average person new to road cycling, the barrier to entry in terms of cost can seem very, very high, especially when it comes to, dabbling in anything that's carbon fiber. Going the direct-to-consumer Chinese route can really level the playing field in this sense, especially as the more mainstream brands continue to kind of creep their prices up and chase that more premium market segment. And that's cool. I mean, if you can afford it, great. There are always people willing to spend a little bit more for a slightly more premium, hassle-free experience. But for those that can't afford it, this offers another route into that realm that's, a lot more accessible. Plus, this approach lets you experiment with your setup and kind of change stuff as you go without breaking the bank. Like, happy with your group set but want some new wheels? Go for it. You get to balance the budget of your build and kind of lean into individualism as you do it. Like my choice of mechanical disc brakes here. Definitely not for everyone, but it works for me right now. Now, it would be quite easy actually for me to whitewash this whole approach, right? Like save loads of cash and get an incredible road bike, no drawbacks at all. But yeah, that's not really the case, and herein lies the trade-off. Much of the time, these cheaper bike parts do perform really well, coming very close, or in some cases, matching the performance of much more premium name brand stuff. But often to get them there does require a little bit more work on your part, and I have countless examples of this. This really cheap carbon frame from AliExpress was great to ride, but it took a good chunk of time and a bit of adjustment on the frame itself to get the cables routed properly. This hydraulic group set from L-Twoo rattled once it was installed. After some investigation, a little grease around this washer solved the problem. Same for these sensor shifters actually. Bit of a rattle. It turned out to be a loose nut, so using a bit of Loctite, just put it back on, all good. These green brake calipers from Z-Race, once everything was plumbed in, they didn't actually work. So turns out there was a machining defect. So when the brake hose is fully seated inside this port, one of the oil channels actually gets blocked, backing off the hose about 2 millimeters before locking down. Problem solved, and the braking is fantastic. This cheap carbon crankset, I covered this in the last episode, but I snapped the crank arm bolt here. A replacement was 10 quid on eBay, plus it looks a lot more chunky, so shouldn't have this issue in the future. And finally, seat posts that slip. They're a common issue with cheap carbon frames. Sometimes the tolerances aren't quite as tight as something from a more mainstream brand. A bit of vinyl packaging around the seat post always gets the job done for me and keeps them solid. Now, yes, there are times when things just break, and I've covered all of these in detail. Most of the time, they're just a bit annoying, like this front derailleur that kept coming loose. In my experience, failures that are immediately concerning in terms of personal safety are quite rare, but no question, there is a greater risk of that with some of these cheaper parts. For example, the really cheap carbon handlebars that you often come across, I tend to steer clear of them these days actually. Historically, they've just caused me too many issues. This set of bars cracked while a friend of mine was riding them. He was totally fine and didn't crash or anything, but I'm sure you can imagine had the potential to cause quite a lot of personal injury. These ones cracked on me about 100 miles after I installed them. Again, I was totally fine, but it could have caused me some serious damage. And finally, this set. They went on okay, but they looked a bit rubbish. They were really flexy, and also, upon closer inspection, had quite a lot of voids present in the carbon, so were clearly quite poorly made. I didn't want to take the risk, and I haven't used them. Other examples of stuff that I've been sent by some of you lot, these chain rings on a racework crankset just bent under power, nearly threw the rider off. The aluminium axle on this cheap crankset just snapped in half. Yeah, pretty obvious what the risk is there. I've also heard tales of cheap chains just snapping under power and cheap carbon rims just randomly exploding. So with that in mind, should you replicate this approach? So if you'd like a bike build where everything slots together and it's nice and straightforward, then no, this approach probably isn't for you. I mean, luckily, virtually every aspect of a bike is standardized these days, so choosing the right parts is easier than ever. But still, even on the simplest builds that I've done, there's always been something that needs a lot more attention. But if you want to give it a go, here are some tips. Straight up, don't buy really cheap carbon handlebars. Some of them are okay, but like I've said, they've routinely given me quite a lot of trouble. Same with cheap chains, just don't bother. Get something from Shimano or SRAM. Over and above that, watch some reviews and generally try and stick with stuff that has a brand name behind it. For example, OG-EVKIN do some great stuff, although more on that frame later on. ZTTO has served me well, so has Z-Race. Riot, I've had a few carbon saddles from them. Sensar and L-Twoo for group sets, and Elite Wheels for cheap carbon wheel sets. The obviously counterfeit and completely unbranded stuff is where you should be a lot more careful. Now, I've had some completely unbranded frames and wheel sets in the past actually, and they've been fine, to be honest, but there is more risk there because the manufacturer isn't willing to put their own brand name behind it. So who knows where it came from, and repeat business is clearly not, top of the agenda for that manufacturer. But regardless of what you choose, one of the many reasons these parts are cheaper is that QC or quality control often isn't what it should be. So you need to do this step yourself. So I think without exception, all of the parts that I've ever had issues with have presented those issues within about the first 200 miles. So once the bike is built, the most important part, take it easy for at least the first 300 miles or so. And during this time, put the bike through a bit of stress in a controlled way. So bunny hop off some curbs, put some tension through the frame and check the brakes. Keep an eye on all the components and give the bike a once over before each ride. If something feels off, check it. Don't go hooning down your local hill at like 40 miles an hour until you're confident everything is fine. Now, if stuff breaks, warranties and the levels of customer service that you're going to receive vary wildly, but often with the really cheap stuff, it's not something you can rely on. Shipping can take anywhere from weeks to months, and processing a return can be pretty convoluted. Again, these parts are cheap and those things contribute to that lower cost. But if you did want to delve into those topics in a bit more detail, this video I did covers a lot of that stuff, so check it out if you fancy it. So yes, at times I find dealing with these cheaper parts incredibly frustrating, and I'm sure you will too, but the issues are seldom insurmountable, and the satisfaction that I get overcoming those issues and ending up with a bike like this where everything is really solid with a price that's basically unbeatable. Yeah, perfetto. One other aspect worth mentioning actually is that some of these Chinese direct-to-consumer brands used to make cheaper stuff but have recently pivoted to produce much more premium gear at a higher cost. Winspace is a great example of this. They now make some really high-end frames and wheel sets that are incredible by all accounts actually. Yolio, much of the same. Elves produce some really high-end frames as well. Even Elite Wheels now make some really premium gear. So in some ways, more established brands like these are kind of exempt from a lot of the points in this video. For example, their levels of QC and customer service are much better, and the warranties they offer are often similar in scope to ones offered by, the big Western brands. This seems to be a bit of a common route actually for some of these direct-to-consumer options, so it's going to be interesting to see where the likes of like Z-Race or ZTTO end up in a few years actually. But anyway, hopefully this video answers a few of your questions and kind of gives you a bit of an insight into my approach and stuff like that. But yeah, subscribe if you like this kind of thing, hit the like button if you enjoyed this episode that I've produced for you, and yeah, massive thanks to Insta360 for propping up what I kind of do around here. Right, anyway, enough of that. See you next time. Ciao.
It's the bonus clip time.
So this frame was incredible to work on, and building the bike around it was really easy, so everything went together really well. But there was a clicking noise that occasionally presented itself when I got the power down and I was stood up out of the saddle and pushed the pedal on the non-drive side, really gave it welly. There was an audible click, and I basically pulled my hair out trying to find out where this occasional sound was coming from. So I tried all the usual suspects like through axle, bottom bracket, and I initially thought it was coming from somewhere up here. So I changed the headset bearings, fiddled around with the compression plug, all sorts. But whatever I did, it just wouldn't go away. So I started using an endoscope to basically check all of the tubes inside the frame. And when I popped it down here, I noticed there was a very small crack on the inside, basically right here. Looking at the box that this frame came in, there's a big rip on the side, so it clearly took some damage during shipping. But the reason I missed it is because if you look, the crack is basically under here, and externally, there is absolutely zero sign of any damage. No scuffs, no scrapes, no dents or anything. But it looks like it took an impact here, and the inner layer of carbon has kind of delaminated ever so slightly. So when you put some torsion through the frame, a tiny bit pops out and creates that clicking noise. Now, OG-EVKIN have actually been really helpful. They're going to warranty the frame and send me a new one, because I bought this myself. It was 613 quid, I think it cost me, maybe a bit more. But basically, again, the frame has clearly taken some damage, and it's not safe to ride. So they'll send me a replacement. But I think I'm going to try and fix it. So I picked this up on eBay. It's basically a carbon fiber repair kit. I think it cost me like 12 quid. It's, I think its target audience is for people wanting to repair carbon fiber fishing poles, actually. But you get some decent quality carbon fiber weave here. And the epoxy they give you has a 40-minute sort of open time. So I've got 40 minutes once it's mixed up to kind of get the patch in place. And I think that's going to be the biggest issue, right? Is that I've got access here, and a little bit of access at the bottom bracket area, but I'm going to have to feed the patch in pre-impregnated with carbon fiber, get it in the right place. But then to kind of get the best adhesion and best strength to reinforce this area, it needs to be under pressure. So I'm thinking once I get the patch in place, which is probably going to be the biggest issue, to be honest with you, I can potentially feed an inner tube in here, inflate it, and that's going to put pressure on the sort of the patch in there, and I'll leave that to cure. But there are a couple of other issues, like it's going to stick to the inner tube, presumably, and then when I come to get it out, I'm not going to be able to. So I think I've got a workaround for that. But basically, yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. So there are a couple of other things to consider when putting a patch like this in place. Like I'm going to have to clean the area inside with some isopropyl alcohol or some acetone. So I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work, but it needs to be cleaned first. The surface is relatively rough in there because it's just bare carbon. So adhesion, once I get it in place, should be okay. And if I put a big enough patch in, I think it should be fine, because the actual crack in here is tiny. It's like this big. So the area affected is very, very small. So a big enough patch should be strong enough. But I know this is not recommended at all, because this frame should be scrapped really. But because that crack is so tiny and it's only on the very inner layer of carbon on here, it seems a shame to just put this in the bin. So I'm gonna try and save it. But yeah, definitely not recommended. But yeah, screw it. I'm going to give it a go. So let me know what you think. And yeah, subscribe so you don't miss it. It might be a complete disaster, but I think it's going to be really interesting. Might not work at all. But yeah, I have to wait and see, I guess. Right. Anyway, enough of that. I'll see you next time. Ciao.